Welcome to Tilt, a podcast from the Santa Fe Art Institute. As a counter to the hunk of sandstone that continues to divide Santa Fe, Alicia, Diego, and Christian examine the history of the Matachines. In this episode of Unsettled, they examine whether the dance, introduced to the Americas through colonization, can become a template for true reconciliation. This is episode 5, part 4, titled Ceremony in Balance.
You are listening to Unsettled.
Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm saying it's that wake up, that breaking free for them chains, it's that welcome to a new age.
Speaking with as an artist that focuses, or that certain bodies of work focus on the Pueblo Revolt and Tewa historical events. I had been invited by local Pueblo leadership along with the Santa Fe Fiesta Council to kind of talk and address some of those issues. And again, it's interesting in the sense that we're not necessarily divided. And I had made the analogy of being like, it's kind of like concrete, where concrete is made up of like different minerals, sand, gravel, water, and then the chemical compound of the cement. And they're all added together and they form this cohesive structure, or that's made to build things or form things, and it can be changed. But once that undergoes the chemical change and becomes that final concrete form, it can no longer be separated back into those 3 or 4 elements that it was created from. And that's kind of how New Mexico culture and thing is, that there's so much things that are here in 2021 that we can't separate. It's here forever, basically. Or you grind it down and it becomes maybe something else. That's probably about it.
In so many ways, it's impossible to return to our pre-contact past, to the days before the Vargas, Peralta, Daniwani, and all the settlers who arrived in their stead, wave after wave. Over time, though, ceremonies persisted, people persisted, and reverence for place persisted, even through conflict, genocide, land grabs, and extraction. Much of what we are left with today is hybrid, including the Matacin Dance, which is performed by Indigenous, mixed Indigenous, Genízaro, and Hispanic peoples. We all share this dance in whatever form it takes, but more than that, this dance is a connective tissue, spanning across geographies from New Mexico, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and Brazil, and taking us to the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, Britain, Greece, and North Africa. It was an embodied form of international relations before there were even nation-states, and the result of globalization before there was a term to describe cultural exchange and empire-making on a global level. To try to pry the dance from its colonial arrival would be, as Jason Garcia says, like trying to undo the chemical conversion of concrete. Like us, the people of New Mexico, the dance is an aggregate. Jason, the Tewa man in black and an artist from Santa Clara Pueblo, has not only collaborated on artwork about the Matachines, which we'll talk about later, but himself danced some of the roles, most recently as the abuelo. He's also witnessed many of its variations up and down the Rio Grande.
So I think kind of that's part of some of those old ceremonies, that sometimes a dance like the Matachines is kind of pretty widespread throughout New Mexico. If you look at as far down south as El Paso and Tortugas Pueblo, you have the Matachines and different dances that are taking place there. And then Rio Grande Valley and Bernalillo and Pueblos in New Mexico. I know there's several different variations that they have in Santo Domingo Pueblo that's usually danced around Christmas time, and San Felipe Pueblo, and I've seen one interesting variation at Cochiti where they have one dancer, but they have a tape player where they were playing a song. I don't know where the song came from, or if it was a recording of maybe a Hispanic village version. But there's like one singular dancer just dancing in the pueblo to that recorded sound with a big loudspeaker. And then I've been to Jemez Pueblo on December 12th when they celebrate Guadalupe Feast Day, and they have a Pueblo version with a drum, and then they have the other version same day has violin and the guitar, and it's two complete sides of the coin, and and then Santa Clara we do it typically on Christmas Day, and I've participated in that as well as a dancer, and my family as well too. My son has danced it, and my father and grandfathers, and my maternal grandmother when she was a little girl, I know was the Malinche at one time too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I mean, so there's that whole family history that you're participating in that dance in the pueblo, where you have different variations. Where again, like even that, like my dad, oh yeah, he danced the Matachines probably in the late 50s as a young man in high school, as he had said, and then as he grew older, was a drummer while I was dancing, and then I know my son danced last year, and I've been pretty much and usually dancing throughout my 20s and 30s, and then it was interesting even in the sense of like 2 or 3 years ago of being one of the abuelos, and then
Wait, you were one of the abuelos?
yeah, and then the other part of it too is the interesting fact of that of being that character as the abuelo. It was interesting in that the fact was that with the group of dancers that I literally was the abuelo, as I was the oldest one. That was the apart from the dancers, I was the oldest member of, I guess you would say, like the dance troupe of the dancers, and the abuelo and the little girl, the liche. And
did they know who you were?
Oh yeah. So people are aware. So.
What do all of these variations of the dance hold in common, if anything? The easy answer is hybridity, a devotion to ceremony, and a commitment to gathering, as a counter to the hunk of sandstone that once was and still is invested with so much power to divide. This episode of Unsettled examines the blueprints that our communities already have for coming together and being in right relation. In fact, while the obelisk sat inanimate for 152 years, the Matachines moved, performing international relations generation after generation. Like so much else here, the dance was and remains an aggregate of people in place, and an example of the ways bonds can form, even from the darkness of colonization. As Santa Fe is now embarking on a new chapter of truth and reconciliation after the collapse of the obelisk, the mayor and city council have put forth plans to create CHART: culture, heritage, art, reconciliation, and truth. It's a weird acronym and kind of unfortunately long, but the goal is to create a widespread, inclusive, and democratic process for community-based engagement. The details, which have been slow to surface, are not unsurprisingly vague. It seems, though, that the collapse of the obelisk, just like the fall of the House of Usher, revealed that so much else is crumbling. Here that includes the most insidious but powerful myth of all: white supremacy. I say this only days after having witnessed the violence of that ideology play out at our nation's capital. I also say this knowing that such far-flung turmoil and the turmoil we face in New Mexico are not unconnected. The question then is, what can Matachines teach us about ourselves and about reconciliation? Like much of this winding story, the answer leads us in pretty much every direction. Let's take it back yet again to one of those points of origin, our Madrecita, Nuestra Virgen de Guadalupe, and her apparition to Juan Diego on the hill of Tepeyac. So, órale, rewind.
The Matachin tradition is something that occupies that space, that really sacred space for winter time, right? The time around, Christmas time through the New Year, but it begins with the apparitions of La Virgen de Guadalupe at Tepeyac, and I think the story is told in the Nikan Mopogwa, which was a Nahuatl um, piece of literature that tells the story of the apparitions of Juan Diego. And the thing that's critical about understanding the story of Juan Diego is, I think, for one, he's a Native American saint, and his entire um, story kind of indigenizes um, these Christian spiritual figures in a way that I think really had a mystical impact on people in Mexico and New Mexico. Um, so Juan Diego in 1531, the 1530s, um, he partook in his own sort of pilgrimage up the hill of Tepeyac, and he wasn't originally intending to seek out La Virgen de Guadalupe, right? That was an apparition that appeared to him. He went up to the hill of Tepeyac for other sort of like personal spiritual practices, and I think it's actually really cool to note that he went up to the hill to honor his ancestors. And so immediately from the get-go, the establishment of his narrative begins with him going back to the place of his ancestors, who would have been indigenous people of the Americas. And so he's going up to this hill in an act of consecration for the sake of honoring his native ancestors. And it was wintertime. It was around the time of December 12th, 11th, 10th, 11th, 12th, or whatever, that whole time. And he walks up the hill of Tepeyac, and he notices it's like unusually like abundant and like green, and there's like he starts like wondering what's going on. And then he has the apparitions of Virgen de Guadalupe, and the cult of Guadalupe and the Guadalupana is what ends up being one of the impetuses for Matachin dancing. So even though like Guadalupe isn't a character in the Matachines dance, she is the reason that the Matachines dance on December 12th to kick off the holiday season. And then some communities dance on Christmas Day, and then of course maybe New Year's. But La Guadalupe, it's interesting to note in the Guadalupana, like the song that's always performed on the day, is that she's presented as a native woman, right? And so when you read the lyrics of the song, it said at the time in 1531, you have to remember like Mexican as an identity or a nationality didn't really exist. And so for someone who's writing from the perspective of speaking on saying that they're Mexican was referring to that, those indigenous communities which Juan Diego would have been a part of. And so she appeared to Juan Diego as a native woman in culture and appearance and demeanor. And she said she's here to intercede on behalf of the well-being of all people of Anahuac. She's here. And Anahuac references the Americas. And so Guadalupe appears to Juan Diego, and she, intercedes on behalf of Native people to, protect them and ensure their prosperity so long as they venerate her, is kind of, the gist of the story.
Our Diego, not Juan Diego, is a member of the Tiwa Piro Manso tribe of Tortugas and has danced Matachines in the past. He has the traje and the waje and spends a lot of time in southern New Mexico in his home community. Their dance, which photographers have been snapping pictures of since the early 1900s, takes place on December 12th, the day of the Virgen de Guadalupe, and Juan Diego is their church's patron saint. If we want to get really nitty-gritty, the apparition of Juan Diego began on December 9th, 1531, just 13 years after Hernan Cortes entered Tenochtitlan, the Aztec city then under the rule of Montezuma II. Hernan's full name was actually Don Hernan Cortes de Monroy y Pizarro Altamirano, Marquis of the Valley of Oaxaca. And though his first efforts at conquering Tenochtitlan failed, he eventually took the city in 1521. Almost exactly 10 years later, the apparition of La Guadalupana took place. The calendar has changed since the 1500s from the Gregorian to the Julian version, so what would have been December 9th on the Julian calendar we use today was actually December 19th on the Gregorian calendar of yore. It's a bit complicated, but the long and short of it is the whole period of mid to late December, now the brunt of our Christmas holidays, could be considered a period of apparition. When Juan Diego, an indigenous man who spoke Nahua, saw a brown skinned woman in the image of Tonantzin appear in what is now the neighborhood of Ciudad Mexico. The time leading up to this historical period is still referenced in Santa Clara Pueblo or Capo Wenge's Matacin Dance.
In Santa Clara, they're sung in Tewa, and they mention, Poseyemo, who's like Montezuma one, not Montezuma two, the one that met Cortez. So there's different things like that, and of songs and rituals, and how they vary, how they're similar.
So there are actually words in the Santa Clara Pueblo
Yes.
dance,
Mm-hmm.
because elsewhere there aren't.
Also, there are, but then, like, I would say Hispanic versions are all pretty much musical.
Yeah.
I mean, it's music notes. But then the Jemez version, I've only seen once, but, I imagine they were singing in Toba. And then the Santa Clara version is in Tewa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and San Felipe they sing
Mm-hmm.
in Cares.
Okay. And I've seen like a variant of a weird, I shouldn't say weird, but I've seen like a variations of the Matachines where it had like all men, and I don't recall them having a little girl.
Yeah.
But it was more like a little, like those belt dances. Like, if you ever see those belt dances in Mexico, where they have like the maypole and they go around like that. And then I've seen like a variation too in Santo Domingo, where it was like that, but all the ladies were dressed in white communion dresses, and they weren't little girls; they were women,
Yeah, we've had a straight up one where they had brought a band into the plaza. From Algodones.
Oh yeah.
And all the men dressed as if they were like a part of the band.
Mm-hmm.
They all wore like tuxedos, suits, dapper down style. Regalia, and then very few dancers. There were more musicians, and we hung Mexican colored flags. And it was dancing for Matachines Day.
In Jemez Pueblo, the dance takes place on 2 days and in 2 forms, according to Dr. Brenda M. Romero, an ethnomusicologist and professor emeritus at the University of Colorado Boulder. Brenda, who says a lot of people share her name in northern New Mexico, identifies as a manita, short for hermanita, or woman of mestiza descent. She grew up in the village of Leiden near Velarde, which now has a population of 245 people. As part of her research on the Matachines, she learned to play the violin from an elder named Adelaido Martinez and performed with him in Jemez Pueblo. She then passed on her Matachin repertoire to another community member, Lawrence Trujillo.
In Jemez, they consider Diego. They also honor San Diego on the 12th of November, and then they honor Our Lady of Guadalupe on the 12th of December. And there's a strong connection between them. Those are the two big, well, except for the corn dances, those are among the biggest feast days, with lots of vendors and lots going on traditionally. Not this year, or I mean, not in 2020, but after March. But they only dance in Jemez. They only dance it on the 12th and on the 1st of the year. And on the 12th, it's considered sacred because it's for Our Lady of Guadalupe, and the musicians don't get paid. But on the 1st of the year, which is Los Manueles, the feast day of San Manuel, they everything is much more relaxed. The Matachines dance over at the infant's house, which is away from the plaza, where they feed people. They still feed people from 5 a.m. till 2 a.m. the next day for 2 weeks before Christmas. Oh no, I'm sorry. From the 24th of December to the 6th of January is when it is that they have the infant's house. And we would dance we would play and dance at the infant's house after the plaza, usually in the late morning. And at the infant's, and then we'd have lunch there. But at the infant's house, there was, when the regular Matachines were dancing, the old women had their own Matachines dance going on the side. And people would be laughing their heads off because they're doing funny parodies. And so they had different, both a sacred thing and then this more playful, laughing thing. But that's a whole other subject, because then you get into the whole idea of humor in the pueblos and how important it's been. And, that it's so interesting. You would think like they're making fun of them. The old women are making fun of them, but they're really not. It's part of the ceremony that the women have that privilege to get out there and be the people who make people laugh. The clown figure, of course, is always so important in the pueblos. Laughing and being of the right heart for a ceremony is so important.
And for Brenda, who studied Matachines from Jemez Pueblo all the way down to Mexico, Peru, and Colombia, the common thread between many of these traditions is water, and in particular Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe's connection to water. Water is life.
Maybe it's general for, prosperity of the crops, so we don't have an end of drought or whatever. Praying for rain. In one place in North Mexico, I spoke with someone who had some Apache background, but he lived in Mexico, and he said, we do this for rain. And so Our Lady of Guadalupe, the actual place where Tonantzin appeared, I think, was a place of water too. So yeah, I do believe that Our Lady of Guadalupe. Years ago when that priest said no, it was they made it up. The church made it up, and people wanted to kill that priest. They may have made it up originally, but it's alive. She's alive in people's hearts and in people's prayers. And I think now that we understand more about energies, not that we understand it well, but we do know that energies do things, and that Native people probably had some understanding of some of that, and people who have been agrarian, or lived on the land and studied it and for centuries and millennia, that there is an intellectual, if you wanted to call it an intellectual embodied tradition, or traditions. So yes, I do believe that. But at the same time, I feel sometimes that when the dogma gets involved, when church dogma gets involved, that it becomes oppressive.
Nuestra Virgencita appears everywhere, on tortillas, the hoods of lowriders, which is almost as miraculous, back tattoos, and on some of the capes that Matachines wear when they're dancing. She, our Indigenous mother, has become ubiquitous in pop culture, but also in the mystical world of apparitions. Case in point, Brenda found in some of her research in northern Mexico that one troupe of Matachines performed in a house where La Virgencita appeared as a water stain on one of the house's walls. 3 years later, the owners of the house and the performers had yet to tell the town's priest, precisely because, well, dogma. Of course, the subtext here is colonization, of Spaniards and other Europeans arriving in the Americas and looking to Christianize a whole continent's worth of people. In fact, just 1 year after Columbus bumbled his way to what we now know as the northern shore of Haiti, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal decree stating that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be, quote, discovered. Discovery following this logic would then lead to making claims to those lands in order for Christian rulers, aka Ferdinand and Isabella, to gain profit, which they sorely needed. Spain was downright poor after all of its battles with the Moors, and the Americas represented a whole new enterprise for filling up the sad, overdrafted Spanish bank account. The Pope was down with exploitation as long as it was in the name of evangelization. It was even encouraged. His exact words were that the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. To some, like anthropologist Sylvia Rodriguez, Matachines was a dance of subjugation, and Brenda tends to agree.
A lot of people argue that it was native, and in Mexico people feel, and that's true too, because when the Spaniards came, they introduced dances, and I do believe that the Matachines was one of the main dances that they introduced, because it looked so much like the native dances and it was easy to superimpose. And they still do versions of Matachines in Mexico that use castanets. Um, it There are some amazing variations of it in Mexico. Um, uh, that one with the castanets is done by the Tlaxcalans who ate it. You know, they helped the Spaniards. Um, but in Colombia, in Peru, it's similar to Mexico, and the one case where I've been is a little bit more similar to Mexico and New Mexico. Um, at least I heard one song in Peru by the fiddle player that was similar to one of the ones we use in New Mexico, and one of the ones that they use in Mexico. But in Colombia, it's much more related to the Commedia dell'arte, and it's a whole nother, totally different variation from what we used to. It's not totally different. There are some structural similarities, but it's a very different event. And um, so the work I've done is, it takes me back all the way to when the Almohads and the Almoravids were in Spain, and Matachines was a dance. Probably didn't call it Matachines at that time, but there is a Portuguese term for it. Only they say Majatan rather than Matachin, and I have found some documents from Brazil where the Portuguese arrived rather, in where there is mention of using the Matachines to enculturate native children in European ways of moving and using some instruments and some feathers and that sort of thing, but ultimately, using the dance to evangelize them and to keep them from doing some of the things that had been traditional that the Spanish didn't like or agree with. And so I think that there's lots of stories that each place where Matachines has gone, and it looks like it's gone to a lot of places where the Spaniards went, that people have kind of transformed it. Um, you see this a lot more clearly in Mexico, where you have so many different varieties, and yet there are so many similarities at the same time that they've been differentiated into different dances.
When the Matachin dance enters the New World, it becomes like a game of telephone where the content of the original message is so changed that what we're left with is a mere echo. The versions here quite possibly could have outlived the original, which itself could have gone back to the Greeks. Tradition holds that even before the dawn of the Roman Empire and the first sparks of Christianity, the Greeks would march what looked like two squadrons opposing each other in processionals, accompanied by musicians. The performance was a way of telling stories about battles after the fact, of creating pageants about the past that helped justify the present. And we know how much Spaniards loved their pageants. So fast forward to Spain in the 1400s and their expulsion of the Moors. It's not inconceivable that the dance would become a handy template for making sense of that moment. It's also not inconceivable that the dance had incorporated Arabic origins, or that it hadn't already been transformed by those people somewhere on the Iberian Peninsula before its arrival in the Americas. It's a huge question mark. But whatever context, Matachines continue to retain at least some of the residue of that early meaning in their role as guardians of the community, even if that's always been symbolic.
It's also important to know, I think, that like certain communities see Matachines as different things, right? but a lot of communities understand Matachines as, warriors or guardians of the community. And so when you dance as a Matachin, you're also taking on the role of like being like a soldier. I don't want to say soldier, like a warrior of sorts. And so this is not just like meant to be theatrical. It's like it is like a battle in a sense. And um, you know, some communities, like when I've danced Matachines, it's very much feels like that when you're dancing it, because the characters of like the Torito and some of the clowns and stuff, they aren't always known to the dancers. Like, yeah, like, like you could recognize your cousins or whatever, but like they don't rehearse or do the ensayo with like the rest of the dancers. It's on their own, and they're only presented to the dancers on the day of the ceremony. And so that's when the real interaction occurs. So it's very much a live event. It's not something that is completely rehearsed all the way through with the interactions. And so you're keeping this footwork, and you're enacting these patterns, these really, really ancient patterns that tell this story, while also having to interact with these characters that are being introduced, right? They're chaotic characters that are trying to throw everything into chaos, and the role of the dancer is to keep everything in balance and to not miss a step and to follow these procedures, right? And it's kind of a way of teaching maneuvering through life. That people will say like the Palma is a way of teaching the Trinity and understanding, those three different um, layers of awareness. But the dance itself is also a way of teaching maneuvering life and understanding what it means to maintain balance and maintain alignment with cosmologies and with cultural and community knowledge, so that you can maneuver through anything in life.
In the Spain of today, however, the Matachin dance is likely no longer performed. And if it is, it's only in the elements that have gotten absorbed into other performances. In contrast, our part of the world has so many versions of the dance that wondering about the original, if that's even possible, is like trying to put together a puzzle whose image you've never actually seen.
And then you wonder how much it changed when it arrived in the New World, and what Mesoamerican influences it had from the Mayans, the Aztecs, all of the thousands of tribes that existed before, and then the tribes that struggled to exist post contact and remained, and what Indians, native people, indigenous peoples of Mexico and Central America and South America that moved with the Spanish to New Mexico, and how that changed that dance also. And then again, what Pueblo people, how that changed, or maybe what their impression was of the dance, and how it got manipulated and changed. And as far as I know, in terms of like photographic, photographic research, I think one of the earliest pictures that I've seen of the Matachines dance at Santa Clara is probably like, I want to say very late 1890s or so, maybe turn of the century. That's like one of the earliest ones that I've seen. And then again, through my own personal family history, paternal side, if my dad is saying, oh, well, his grandfather had danced the Matachines, and I believe when he had passed, he was in his 80s, and I believe he passed in like mid 1960s. So if you're thinking like that's late 1870s, 80s, somewhere in there, and if this dance already existed prior, you got to go at least 1850s, 1800s plus. So then you're thinking also, well, maybe 1700s. But, again, there's really like no written, I don't know if there's an actual written history if you looked for it. I know there's books out there, but like where does it actually come up in writings and things?
History, Brenda says, is at best speculative. We put sources together, but there's never a moment of total clarity. How culture spreads is sometimes too messy for us to map.
Wow. So if you're thinking again, being Onyate, coming to Junge Owinge, or Yunge Owinge, I'm saying that for my other Tewa people.
They pronounce the J.
They would, that's like that, what would you call that? That ripple where that stone hit and then it expands from there. So if the next Pueblo is, okay, at that time would be Santa Clara, Hapua, Owinge, and then there's other Pueblos, Tewa Pueblo, Tewa villages, no longer modern day Pueblos, but you have Tsama, Tsamajo, Tsamayo, Chimayo. There are places up and down the Santa Cruz River. And San Alfonso, Pohoge, Owinge. And so, you kind of see that as that little it kind of has that ripple effect. So I would imagine that you would have, if this was this dance to kind of celebrate one conquest over new peoples of the new world, and also that joining conquest, but also like joining and merging and let's be friends. Yeah, that's what they dance. It's like some kind of a night dance. I think they think night as in KNIGHT, Kenigits. Nights like that. It's like some kind of play, and they do it out in Chihuahua, or I've seen it somewhere.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, and I can't.
Yeah. And
so it's symbolic.
It's symbolic
in the way of like this is the first time.
Yeah. And so I imagine that if you're introducing this dance, then I would imagine it would be performed in other pueblos. Other pueblos would then adopt it or not adopt it, or maybe it just kind of fizzled out because of various reasons, which often happens in Pueblo country with different dances and ceremonies, and sometimes things evolve, and part of that evolution is where things are abandoned or lost or transformed or changed. And so I would imagine there would probably be Matachines dances in most of the modern the Tewa Pueblos and other Keres, Tiwa Pueblos of that time period.
So yeah, we do have to imagine a lot, or at the very least get away from the Western desire to know and catalog everything. Matachines in that way challenge categorical knowledge because, quite simply, it's one of those performances where the mystery of its diffusion may never fully be revealed. Okay, let's come back to the present for a moment. Where exactly does truth and reconciliation fit in our community? The terms have been so deeply overused that it's hard to know what they actually mean anymore without thinking of far-off places like apartheid South Africa. Dr. Bjorn Krondorfer is director of the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University and endowed professor of religious studies in the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies. A participant in Santa Fe Art Institute's Truth and Reconciliation residency, Bjorn recently published a book on the Holocaust and histories of reconciliation. It's called Unsettling Empathy.
As we probably talk about it later too, I think it is absolutely essential that every nation or communities within a nation look at their own past with great honesty and directness, even if it makes people uncomfortable, because there are things in every nation's past, including some families, where there was wrongdoing, culpability by the people that you love or the people that you identify with. So for me to actually really look directly at the history of the Holocaust, meaning the attempted genocide against all Jews in Europe by Nazi Germany, it was actually really important for me to be in a different country to do so, and look at this from afar, while also identifying with my own history. Not cutting loose those connections, but taking into account that there are different perspectives on that past. So I think it's essential. It is good to move between different worlds to get a good understanding of oneself, but also about other people and other people's histories.
So it's one thing for history to be blurry and uneasy to map, like the arrival and diffusion of the Matacin Dance. It's another to actively erase or repress history. The first lesson in Repression 101: white people at the US Capitol last week. When you repress violent and traumatic parts of the past, like colonization and slavery, in a way that is self serving, what you end up with is a recipe for MAGA maniacs dressing up like Vikings and attempting a coup on the US government, and then thinking those actions belong to a righteous cause.
Yeah, you know, hyper nationalism in a country like the United States is could theoretically mean that all Americans bond together over a common good, an understanding of the common good, of a common civil good, independent of the beauty of our differences. But unfortunately, hypernationalism doesn't mean that. Hypernationalism means the opposite, at least right now. It really means white supremacy at this point. So nationalism, hypernationalism is that uh, white supremacists think that America is really for white people, more or less, and with some permission for others to join that club, but really to exclude most other people. And that is the really lethal, toxic climate that we're living in right now. Um, why is this happening? In all likelihood, um, I would say two things. I mean, there are more, but I would say two things. One is um, America hasn't faced honestly its past. So there were attempts here and there, but really as a whole nation to fully confront the legacy of slavery and the legacy of colonialism just has not happened to the extent that it needs to. And the second one is fear. The people are currently afraid of all kinds of things. There's economic insecurity, there's insecurity giving the healthcare system, there's insecurity giving the climate challenges we have. There are so many insecurities. And that fear often translates into holding on to something that seems to make sense and meaning to people. And for some, it is hypernationalism.
How then do we fully look at the past? Like, really look at it, even as it resides in ourselves and in the profound violence that was requisite to colonization in New Mexico, and still move forward?
So I use the term unsettling empathy, by which I mean that we don't unsettle or deconstruct empathy, but that empathy unsettles us, that an active empathy unsettles our values, unsettles our understanding of the other person, unsettles perhaps the understanding of ourselves, might unsettle the way how we perceive history. So it may unsettle us on many different levels if we, for a moment, empathized enough with the other person's point of view that we actually fully grasp the effect and importance of that other reality for the other person, that we feel like we have um, put aside until this moment. So to me, this kind of unsettling empathy is crucial if we want to move forward and forward in a conversation where we understand each other before we jump to either solutions or fall back to mutual accusations.
In a way, unsettling empathy happens not only on an intellectual level, but on a visceral level, in our bodies, which is Diego's point about the Matachin dance.
When you fully love yourself completely, it also includes those things too, right? And so I think Matachines is at its core, like it's a way to teach that. It is a community teaching tool they say it's a way to teach the Trinity, but what does the Trinity represent? It represents that ultimate union of, spirit with universe with body, and what it truly means to understand your place. And that's kind of, it's teaching that self-love, right? When you could proudly dance as a Matachin, as a gardener of your community, as someone who carries all these different cultural influences with you, as someone who understands the sacredness of their ancestors and their ancestry and what they're dancing for, and all of like the elements that go into it in terms of like regalia and footwork and stuff, and really just connect to this sacred place. That's the ultimate goal, right? In terms of um, doing what you need to do. I don't know how else to say it. Yeah, but it's definitely a way of teaching that to communities, teaching history through this dance, teaching self love, teaching community love through this dance, teaching that it's okay to have mixed ancestries through this dance, right? Teaching, like, that's a big part of it too, right? Like, I think little kids growing up who dance Matachines and stuff, they probably get a lot of that. That probably, I think helps them navigate through who they are, right? When you could like have a painted guaje, a rattle in one hand, a palma in the other, when you could wear like a cupio and have moccasins on, and like really be proud of all those elements, then why shouldn't they should be. That's how it should be, right? Like a kid should love all themselves and be proud of themselves, and people should love all themselves and be proud of themselves, and know that they're doing good and dancing on behalf of good and dancing on behalf of light overcoming darkness, and carrying that with them through the year, carrying that with them through life. And Matachines teaches that. It teaches that without having to write it down in the big old Bible that some people aren't going to read, right? So I think it does what it needs to do, and it's not going anywhere. A lot of people can say, a lot of people who don't know the dance and don't have never danced it, or don't really fully understand the spiritual embodiment of Matachines, will write it off as something completely colonial, right? But if you can't, it's like, if something truly is adopted by a community, you can't disregard that either, right? Like, if something's was abandoned and was brought into a community and re-given its purpose, then that's a good thing.
But like everything else, it's complicated, almost too complicated to fully grasp in words. And maybe this is why it's sometimes easier to teach history through movement, and not in the way that a quadrilla of men would dress as colonizers and roll up in school gyms and perform some upside down version of conquest for school kids, but in a way that acknowledges complexity and the multiple versions of a still unfolding story. It's kind of a big task. You may have wondered at some point why we haven't identified all the characters of the Matachin dance. And really, it's because we've tried to draw a bigger picture about contact here in New Mexico and throughout the Americas, and the ways that hybridity really gets embodied. But the other reason we haven't gotten into the details of the characters is because now that Matachines continue to spread, each iteration is just a little bit different. Each nonetheless reflects the past, but also the dance's place in the here and now.
I think as far as characters are concerned, they definitely correlate to that as well. You have the monarcha, the king, Montezuma. You have Malinche, the little girl, and then you have like the dancers, who are kind of like the keepers of the patterns, right? And then you have the toro, who represents bad things and also represents colonial Spain. And then you have the abuelo spirits, the abuelito spirits, who are kind of like ancestral spirits of the land and of the families, who kind of like are guardians of the community. And then you have, depending on which community you come from, you have other sort of like clown spirits. And I think, in understanding these characters, one really important thing to um, know about the characters is that they are kind of like supernatural beings. And this is something that's, I, you know, depending on who you ask, I'll say this because this is how I understand it, but this is something that is very much rooted in indigenous ways of knowing when it comes to ceremony, right? You embody this being, right? This entity, this spiritual presence when you're dancing, And so you'll often hear people refer to people as like a Matachin or like the Matachines in like this really, abstract sense, because you don't want to directly reference the people doing the dance like as your cousins or your brothers or your friends or whatever. They're strictly Matachines in that sense, and it's a very mystical dance. It's probably one of the most mystical aspects that is attached to Catholic New Mexico, if you even want to call it attached to Catholic New Mexico at this point.
As Brenda has found in her research, there are Matachines in Kansas, including all women's groups from Michoacan. In San Antonio, Texas, there are over 500 Matachin groups who gather annually on the Day of Our Lady of Guadalupe. In Mexico, young people have introduced disco sounds to Matachin dances. And as Jason remembers, there was that one guy dancing the Matachin dance to the sounds of a boombox at Cochiti Pueblo some years ago. Let's also not forget the big band version in San Felipe that Christian recalled.
You don't really hear too much of once the Spanish government, the Spaniards, the conquistador, those individuals, like who were the greatest hits of the Mexican government that was here prior to United States, quote unquote, conquest of New Mexico in 1848. I think Kearney was the one that came in. So I think there's those so yeah, that's those things that you have to take into consideration in terms of contact of forced conversion of Catholicism and Christianity on Pueblo people. So sometimes I think Pueblo people were were hesitant to adopt new traditions and new religions, and other times Pueblo people were very quick to adopt those traditions and change them and adapt them, and it's assimilation, acculturation, adaptation of those dances, of those ceremonies. And sometimes part of Pueblo life too is just like, okay, we'll accept it and just leave us alone, and we'll just do this just to make you happy, and we don't want to. We just leave us alone, where our lives are going great already, and if this will help us get you off of our backs, we'll do the Matachines dance on Christmas Day. Okay, we have our feast day. We have our celebrations that are based on seasons. We have our dances and our ceremonies that are tied to cycles of the moon, cycles of agriculture, hunting, solstice, equinoxes, and we have a ceremony that happens in the summertime. Oh, by the way, it's also close to August 12th, Santa Clara Feast Day, St. Clair of Assisi. Okay, well, it makes sense to have this ceremony at that time because it's close enough. So we'll adapt and we'll assimilate and we'll acculturate to your calendar. Oh, Easter. Oh, we have our spring ceremonies at Easter time. Oh, Easter time is the same time as, the rising of Christ from the grave and from his tomb. And okay, that fits within our calendar as well too. So we'll take it and we'll adapt it, and we'll figure out a way to coexist.
As a cultural form, the Matachin dance is malleable, adaptable, fluid. It is now indigenized. That complexity comes through most potently in the figure of La Malinche.
I was told a long time ago by a conchero, Sonora, who rest in peace, Sonora, but he told me that Malinche is it's the name of a mountain in Puebla, and that it was a term of honor, and that it was used for both men and women as a term of honor. But of course, we took that, and it was Doña Marina, La Malinche, we tend to think of the term coming from her because that's the way it's been disseminated. But it was probably her honorific term because apparently they also called Cortés Malinche. Um, and so, yeah, in Mexico, of course, the Malinche figure has since the 20th century, there's been a lot of, she's been very maligned, or maybe even earlier. I don't know exactly when she began to be maligned, and she usually wears a red mask when she's featured in dances, and she's still a symbol um, of uh, betrayal, I guess. But that was a kind of a male intellectual idea in Mexico. Um, I don't know what to think, except that she was probably a slave, and she probably didn't have any choice um, but to help Cortez. Who knows? It was complicated. You can get lost in any of these little bits because there were so many things going on. Like the Spaniards weren't necessarily not marrying natives; but they would only marry royalty, uh, you know, native royalty, and that sort of thing. So when the Malinche figure, when we see the Malinche figure in New Mexico, where we all think of her as the first Christian convert, or maybe we don't all think of her that way, but the first Christian convert, um, and chastity, purity, and chastity, and a lot of things like that.
And she, like the other characters, has her own song. In Manito communities, as Brenda says, the music is played with the violin. The following is the song for La Malinche, as played by Dr. David Garcia, a cultural anthropologist and musico from the town of El Huache, who plays for the alcalde Matachines on the 2 days following Christmas.
She is a historical figure known as a Malintzin. Um, she has she was known as an interpreter historically during the expedition and with Hernan Cortes. She was Hernan Cortes's interpreter, and so the this part of the dance is that La Malinche, who's dressed in all in white, um, usually a young woman, um, usually uh, barely in her early teens, dances this role. Uh, that dancer goes and dances with each one of the danzantes, and then does a pantomime with the two with the palma, which is a kind of like looks like a trident, um, and literally in Spanish, palma means a palm from like a palm tree, um, and then the other instrument that she has is a waje, or a rattle. And so with these, she has a. It's interesting for me. It's like a dialogue with the main dancer through pantomime, no, with um, these two instruments, um, and so after that, the dance um, kind of there's a part in the dance that is called el torito, and the torito is kind of a figure that kind of circles the dance and doesn't enter the middle of the dance until this part of the dance. In this part of the dance, the torito dances with each one of the danzantes, similarly to like the part where the Malinche did. And the purpose of the Torito, well, I don't know the purpose of it, but with the Torito, after the dance with the Torito, um, every single one of the danzantes dances with the Torito, including La Malinche. La Malinche is the first one that dances with the Torito.
The Matachines have spurred other cultural forms beyond the dance, like the artwork I mentioned earlier by Jason Garcia and Chicano santero Vicente Tellez. Together, they worked on a piece called La Malinche y los Matachines, a title that played on my favorite grupo of all time, Selena y los Dinos. The artwork incorporated versions from Pueblo and Manito communities.
We kind of settled on the idea of the Malinche in the center, and then the musicians on the other side. In those, there's three pieces that are interchangeable, or they can be slid out of the wooden piece, and so they can be on flip sides. So one side is my flip of where it's in the middle is Malinche. In the Pueblo Santa Clara version that we dance on December 25th in Santa Clara, and then on the reverse side is the little like the Hispanic village version that you would see like in Bernalillo or Alcalde or San Juan, Pueblo even, and or Okeowinge, and then on the other side is it can be flipped where it's the Pueblo version, Santa Clara Pueblo version with the Pueblo dancers, and then on the other side is Pueblo singers with the drum, and Santa Clara and Jemez Pueblo are the two Pueblos that do it with the drum version, and then I know a couple others do it with the violin and guitar, and I know they have different musicians from the local Hispanic villages that come out and help them play, that do the music accompaniment, and then on the reverse sides on Vicentes, it has the he chose to do the Bernalillo version because he's one of his friends is a dancer, participant in the Bernalillo that's celebrated on August 10th, San Lorenzo feast day. And so one of the images of the actual dancer is Vicente's friend.
In the end, the dance arrived with colonization as a tool for forced conversion and for demonstrating power. But as Diego told me, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If the ceremony brings people together, people who at times have been divided, then at least for a moment it creates synergy, energy, and just maybe the power to heal. It is ceremony in balance.
I've gone a little further by looking at synergy as the potential for creating energy that is what heals. So it's actually a very positive outlook in which working together or dancing together in kind of a single, a kind of a solitary intent, a kind of a focus, does in fact create energy. And I mean that also comes. I mean I myself have merged so many different beliefs to get to this point. I could talk about other influences, but I do believe that the miracles happen, and I do believe that people dance this to Our Lady because Our Lady is a focal point for these prayers. If you have thousands and thousands of people praying to Our Lady of Guadalupe, and this is post quantum theory too. This idea that and going back to my dissertation, that people dance and there's an intent. I mean, if you don't get in the dance line, sometimes they drag you in, because the more people dancing and singing and doing this, the more the better the ritual, the more effective, the stronger the result.
Got this pine cone in my brain. Got my eyes open, I'm sane. It's that wake up, that breaking free from them chains. It's that welcome to a new age. This right here for like a new.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Tilt Unsettled. This episode was produced by Alicia with interviews by Diego and post-production by Christian. Our theme song is rapper Wake Self's Holy Water. It can be found on his posthumous album, Ready to Live. Unsettled is a 9-part series. Keep listening on our website at sfai.org or the SFAI channel at podbean.com. This project is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts.
Yeah, bump, bump in the trunk, third eye opened up, third eye opened up, yo. Bump, bump in the trunk, third eye opened up, third eye opened up. Keep it alkaline, keep it alkaline. Keep it alkaline, keep it alkaline. What's your dharma and your dharma?